Hello everyone and welcome back to PC Retro Tech. In recent videos on the channel we've been looking at old graphics hardware standards for the IBM PC and compatibles. And I thought I'd switch it up a little bit today and look at the software side of graphics. Now this is a huge topic. It could encompass things like games, which we've covered before, dithering, JPEG decompression, fractals. It could cover things like ray tracing, and also CAD software and the specialized hardware that often went with it. We're not going to cover any of that today. What I want to focus on is drawing programs that were available for the average consumer in the early 80s and 90s on something like my IBM XT here with a CJ or EGA card, and a little bit off screen here is my Compact 386 with a VGA card. And we're going to look at the algorithmic advances that enabled more and more complex drawing primitives in drawing software. And this is really fascinating if you're into graphics as I am. Before we get to that though, a very small announcement. In the previous video I mentioned that a demo that I'd been involved with, Area 5150 for the original IBM PC, was nominated for 2 Meteoric Awards. And wouldn't you know it, we actually won the Best Technical Achievement category. And so here's a photograph of the little trophy that we got. There'll be certificates for everyone as well. And we actually got the honourable mention in the Best Old School Production category. So very, very pleased with that result. And now we've got to work extra hard on getting the final version of that demo out before we start working on the next big thing. Our starting point today is a program called Gem Paint, which runs on the Gem operating system, which Atari and Amstrad users might be familiar with from way back in the day. Although this is a modern version of that called FreeGem. There's a link in the description. This is running in VGA 64480, so there'll be tiny text, which is probably a little bit blurry on camera, but that'll improve when we get into the main app. So I did try running this on my XT, but the install hung for reasons unknown. So this is running on my 386, and it'll run the original Gem Paint app, version 1 from way back in the day. This will be VGA 16 colors, but it'll limit us to a 320 by 200 drawing area. And the really cool thing about this program is it has a very small number of drawing primitives which it combines in lots of interesting ways. So the first one is straight line drawing, and there's nothing surprising about that. There's also a flood fill routine, another very straightforward algorithm, and basically if you have a bounded region and you click in it, it will fill it. It's very quick on my 386 of course, so very straightforward to implement. Then there is a freehand drawing thing, which is just going to put dots where the mouse cursor is, so this is very easy to implement as well. And then there's a spray can. Now this one, as far as I can tell, uses a fixed pattern, and it just repeats that pattern wherever the mouse cursor is. And it gives a kind of spray effect, which I think looks alright. By the way, here's some images that are distributed with Gem Paint. Here's a tiger which looks to me like it's been drawn freehand. There's not really much use of drawing primitives here except maybe some fill. And then there's this much simpler hand with a wrench, and this is just straight lines and curves by the looks of it. Then you have this beautiful house drawing, and this is really just straight lines and a lot of flood fill with patterns. So very good use of the primitives there. And then the final one is this ship, and I think that the sails on this ship have probably been done using some of the curves, which we'll look at shortly. The rest of it's a lot of straight lines and probably a lot of hand-drawn artwork, maybe some spray paint in the clouds. The most complicated algorithm here is the final one, and that is the ellipse. Now the primitive here is actually the quarter ellipse, and I'll just draw one of those so you can see what it looks like. You just drag it out, and you can see that the restrictions are it has to have a vertical and a horizontal axis. You can't have ellipses at other angles. So those are called diagonal ellipses, and they're much, much harder to draw. In fact, this program even cheats by drawing a lot of straight lines, I'm pretty sure, rather than filling in all the points for the ellipse here. So it really is a very basic implementation here. And actually I've spent the last few weeks trying to implement a diagonal ellipse routine, and I can tell you it's a lot of work in comparison to drawing these kind of ellipses. Now the main ellipse routine, all it does is flip the quarter ellipse horizontally and then vertically to give an entire ellipse. So let me show you what that looks like. And again, the restrictions are it has to have vertical and horizontal axes, it can't be rotated, and it also has to fit in the drawing area. So if you try to go any bigger, it just won't let you. So that's a common restriction for ellipse drawing from back in the day. The reason for that is they don't want to have to clip every pixel, figure out is it inside or outside the drawing region. That slows things down. So for performance reasons, they don't let you draw a bigger one. Now pretty much everything else that this program does, apart from text, which I won't count, is a combination of those basic routines. So for example, this one here is the most primitive. It just draws little squares, but when you drag it, it looks like you're drawing a nice thick line. So this one here is a rectangle, and basically it's just straight lines and a flood fill. This one here is a rounded rectangle, and it does exactly the same thing, except that now it draws a quarter ellipse for each corner. So there are actually 3 primitives being used to draw this. So again, nothing really new here, just a combination of 3 existing primitives. Then there is the polygon, and basically you draw as many lines as you want until you've got the shape that you're after, and when you're done you double click and it'll finish it off and fill it in. So again, just straight lines and flood fill, so nothing really new here. And we've already seen the ellipses. The final one is this one. This is kind of a cool one. Basically, if I draw a freehand shape here, it'll eventually time out and decide that it's finished. Draw a straight line to finish the shape off and then fill it in. So again, this is 3 primitives: freehand drawing, straight line, and flood fill. A cool thing you can do with this, by the way, is draw something that oscillates a lot and ends up back in the middle, and then because you crossed over the line that it draws at the end many times, you'll end up with lots of separated regions, which is kind of nice. But again, it's just freehand drawing, straight line and fill, so nothing really new here. So basically this program is not very large. It can be done in a very small amount of code because there are only a very small number of primitives. The only other thing that it offers that I can find is patterns. Let me show you those. So we're just using the ordinary colors here, but if I select this one, it'll give me a whole bunch of patterns I can use. For example, this here, maybe I'll even use this one. And if I do a rounded rectangle, it's going to, instead of fill it using just a single color, it will take the pixels, the pixel colors from pattern in memory. It's only a very, very small pattern, just repeats over and over. So it's a very minor modification of the ordinary flood fill routine. So I think this is a really good starting point. It's very primitive, and as we'll see with some of the later programs, there's a lot more you can do as you add more drawing primitives. Gem Paint came out in 1985, around July, and this is another program that was available in 85. This is Zsoft PC Paintbrush, which actually became Microsoft Paintbrush and was distributed with Windows eventually. So I believe versions 1 and 2 of this may have actually come out in 1984, but I'm using a version here called PC Paintbrush Plus, which came out in 88. The main difference is that it supported scanners, and I'm using it because it supports VGA, so we have 256 colours. Of course, VGA itself only came out in 87. So let me show you some of the different features that this has in comparison to Gem Paint. So it does have a spray can, but this one is just doing random dots instead of fixed pattern. So that's a little bit of a difference from Gem Paint. And this tool here, I actually had a little bit of a head scratch to figure out what it was doing. This is the eraser, and as you can see, it just erases pixels, as you might imagine. And then the other one seemed to be doing basically the same thing. I thought it would be the freehand drawing tool, and that maybe there's a bug and they kind of had the same icons hooked up to the same tool by mistake. But when I had multiple colors on the screen, I realized what it's doing is actually just blanking out pixels of the selected color. So it'll get rid of the green pixels, but not the magenta ones. Not very difficult to implement, but still a nice feature. And it turns out that this is actually the freehand drawing tool here, and of course that functions just like it did in Gem Paint. There didn't seem to be an image distributed with the version of PC Paintbrush that I have, but in one of the older versions there's this eagle here. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to open it in any version of PC Paintbrush that I have, and so I've actually opened it in a different paint program here, which is probably why there's a little bit of corruption at the bottom of the screen here. But yeah, I can see some of the primitives, especially the curves being used here. Otherwise, I think this is a fair bit of freehand drawing. Of course, there are straight lines, no big surprises there. You just right click to finish a region off, and let's do a flood fill here. That's also very similar to Gem Paint. I did notice that the flood fill occasionally misses a pixel in one of the corners, but this is a problem with a lot of flood fill routines, and you don't see it very often, and probably it happens in Gem Paint as well. Of course, there are rectangles, rounded rectangles, and ellipses. There's a slight difference here. If I draw a rounded rectangle, it'll just show the fill, and if I want a border on that, then I basically have to do it separately. So let's check out the ellipses, because those are a little bit different. The first thing you'll notice is that it will allow me to draw an ellipse that's bigger than the display. So that's one thing we couldn't do in Gem Paint. Unfortunately, it does the clipping at the edge of the displayed region rather than the edge of the canvas, which is really a bit odd. I'd certainly prefer it to be the other way around. And of course, the ellipses still have to have vertical and horizontal axes. There's no diagonal ellipses here. But now we come to a new and very interesting primitive which the Gem Paint program didn't have, and that is cubic splines. So you'll draw a line, basically you'll get the start and end points, and then you drag it out like this. And what it's doing is it's picking a curve so that the slope at this end of the tangent will run through that point, and the slope at this end will run through that point. So I'll select that, and then if I drag it the other way, then it's just changing the slope at one end of the curve and leaving the other one fixed. And so you can get some really nice shapes this way that you wouldn't be able to get if you just had ellipses. So it's really nice to have splines in your drawing toolkit. If I fill that in, you can see I get a really nice shape there. Now, the reason that splines are so interesting is you can chain them together. So for example, if I do another spline here, I'll start it off at the same point as I finished the other one, and I'll go out to here, and then I'll drag it so that it follows on smoothly from the original one, like this, and then I can drag the other end like that. And so now you see my original curve just smoothly flows into the next one. So being able to control the slope at the ends is really what gives you that capability. So very, very nice feature to have, and I really want to implement this at some point myself. It is probably just about as hard as diagonal ellipses though, so don't expect it on the channel anytime soon. Now that's not everything, there's also patterns. This is a little bit similar to what we had in Gem Paint. It's a little bit buggy though. I'll select this Def 4. This is just the ordinary 256 color palette. And as you can see, I get a whole load of different patterns here, which I can actually edit. But there are some bugs now with the menus, and it's a little bit annoying. So you can only change these pixels here on the left, and that'll give you a pattern there. Once you're done, you accept. And so let's just draw ourselves a filled rectangle. So very similar functionality to what we had in Gem Paint, just a bit buggy. But there are some other things which I would call effects rather than drawing primitives. So they all apply if you select a rectangle here. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. It's called the pick, and so it'll allow me to rotate that, unfortunately just by a multiple of 90 degrees. I can also do a horizontal flip. I can invert the colors. I'll take them back, doesn't look very good, and I can shrink or grow it, basically change the shape of the region like this. And the other thing that I can do is this tilt thing, and for some reason it doesn't work very well. I have to do another selection, so let me do that, and then I think the tilt will work. And you can see I can just go left and right. I don't know whether it's possible to do an up or down tilt, but anyway, if I do that, it just skews all the pixels across in their rows by a different amount. And it's also very easy to implement this, but this is just basically an effect rather than a drawing primitive as such. And most of the rest of the stuff here is just for fonts, so I'm not going to cover that. There's also the ability to cut and paste small sections from the image and save to various file formats. The original ZSoft PC Paintbrush just supported PCX format, I think. Well, we've tried ZSoft's PC Paintbrush, so we have to try their competitors from back in the day. This is PC Paint by Mouse Systems, and they also had releases in 84, 85, and this version is from 89. And probably the ZSoft one was also released in 89, even if it was written in 88. A lot of the options here are very similar to what we've seen before. We've got a freehand drawing and an eraser, of course. And this is similar to Gem Paint, where we have a thick line. We can also draw straight lines. That's all done with the left mouse button this time. And we'll just check that the flood fill option works, and it does. So this is all very similar to what we've seen before. There were lots of images distributed with PC Paint, but most of them are just line drawings, and it's really hard to tell whether they're actually drawn in the program or scanned in. A lot of them look very sketchy, but I picked a couple that looked okay. So there's this wine bottle here, and the other one is this elephant, and it's the only one I could find with any colour in it. So they really weren't showing off the features of their program particularly well with these images, in my opinion. Now, coming down to the primitives, well, it looks like we've got more options here, but a lot of these we've seen. We've got the rectangle. We'll do a rounded rectangle just for old time's sake. And let's try out their ellipses and see how that's different. And yeah, it does look like it will draw an ellipse off the edge of the screen. But when I go to show the picture, you can see that the clipping is again just to the displayed region, not the edge of the canvas. It's really not how I would do things. So then there's the curves. Oh, and by the way, the ellipses are vertically and horizontally oriented. There's no diagonal ellipses here. For curves we have, well, it's a little bit different. So you draw a line, and then the right mouse button, you click out, and as you can see, it's just drawing a curve through the given point. So instead of controlling the tangents, you're just controlling the point that the line goes through. And it also has a fill option. Now, the nice thing about the fill in this program is that there's all the patterns displayed down below. So if I draw something, then I can see what the fill is going to be. It's a little bit easier to use those than in PC Paintbrush. And of course we have the same freehand drawing thing as we had in Gem, and there's also a polygon option, and that's nothing new either. Where this program really does something different is in the fill options, and I'll show you those. There's something called a flood fill and an edge fill. It's a little bit difficult to predict when the edge fill will fill to the edge of the screen and when it will just fill to a given color. But anyway, let's switch that on, and it really only makes sense to look at this with a spread as well. And we'll just do a normal spread to the right, and I don't know, I'll just select some color here, and we'll see what comes up. It may help if I select the flood fill option, and as you can see, it just does a whole bunch of colours which change as you go across to the right. So now let me select this option, which will spread out from a point, and we'll see what that looks like. And as you can see, it stopped short here for some reason. So this is what is a little bit difficult to work out with the edge fill option. It's a little bit unpredictable. So the other thing we can do now is go back to a flood fill and just fill one of those regions in. So you get some nice effects that way. And I'll also show the dither option. Here I'll do an edge fill out from the center of the screen. And yeah, so it does a dither pattern in concentric circles. So that's also very nice. And then there's also this line option as well, and I'll just do a diagonal version of this just to show what that looks like. And you can see that it kind of does a weird line pattern that sort of zigzags down the screen, and it's interfered with by what we'd drawn previously. So you can get all sorts of really nice effects this way. And of course, just like PC Paintbrush, we can select a region, and there are a bunch of things that we can do here. Actually, invert colors just seems to invert the whole screen, at least when it's working. Here, maybe it didn't do that, so it's a little bit unpredictable again. Anyway, flip horizontal, flip vertical, we've seen before. Rotate, again, it's just by 90 degrees. And drop shadow is a little bit more difficult to show. So I'm just going to do a new image here, and we'll draw something like a triangle to start us off with. Maybe I'll make it a solid triangle, and we'll select that, and now let's do a drop shadow and see what happens. And unfortunately nothing here, probably because I didn't have a background. So let's do a flood fill background here, and then I'll draw my lines and see if that makes any difference. Do a selection, that'll probably do the job, and we'll do a drop shadow, and you can see it puts a white drop shadow on. And there's also an outline option which adds yet another line. So this is a little bit bizarre. I don't know that these are very consistent, especially when you're combining effects. The other thing you can do is make a pattern out of a region that you selected, and then that pattern can be used to fill objects. So if I drew an object up here, it would fill it with the pattern that I took. So that's a nice feature. Seek Edge and Transparent I haven't been able to get to work. They should work for the whole image, not just the selected image, but unfortunately I just haven't been able to find an image on which they do anything. So that's basically the end of PC Paint. Now you might imagine that that was the end of the rivalry between ZSoft and Mouse Systems, but in 1990 ZSoft released PC Paintbrush 4, and it really was an improvement. I'll show you in a moment. First, I wanted to show you this list of graphics cards that they supported. In the early 1990s, all the Super VGA cards had slightly different modes, and it really is a technical achievement that they managed to list essentially all of the major graphics modes that were out there at the time they produced their product. In fact, this list has almost 400 different graphics modes on it, which is really quite impressive indeed. Relax, I didn't draw this myself. This is an image that came with PC Paintbrush 4, and I'm recording this on a genuine CRT, an NEC multi-sync. This is VGA, of course, and I believe that I have the focus a little bit better now. So of course there's always going to be a mismatch between the resolution of the screen and the camera, and usually you get some banding, color banding called moire, if you focus too much, and otherwise you have a slightly blurry image. But this particular image just doesn't seem to be affected and looks okay, which I'm pretty happy about. But you might be wondering, how am I recording VGA at all, since I haven't been able to do that on the channel previously? And that's because my camera has a hardware limitation of 30 frames a second, And even 70, if I divided it in half, would be 35, still too high for the camera. So I really have to take 1/3 of 70 as the frame rate, and of course that is not a frame rate supported. But what I've done is use some software that hacks the firmware of the camera to allow very small increments of frame rate, so I can get very, very close at least to 1/3 of 70. That's still leaving a little bit of flickering there, but not very intrusive at all. I'd still have some limitations. Because of the software itself, I can no longer record in the full resolution, and some people have noticed that the videos looked a little bit crushed. The other limitation is I can only record up to 2 minutes of video at a time. Actually, on that topic, did you know that European cameras of this type, for taxation reasons, can't record more than 30 minutes of video by law? Isn't it amazing what our politicians sit around thinking up? And unfortunately for me, moving to the UK did not fix my camera, even though it's no longer part of the EU. But let's take a look at the effects that this program does. Now, most of the new stuff is actually under the effects menu, and I'll show you the blend. This is essentially just going to blur the image slightly by picking colours that are nearby and just sort of blending them together. There's also another option that it's called smudge, which basically just rearranges the pixels. It doesn't actually change any of the colours. And then there's a brightness option. We'll select a fairly high setting here, and what this will do is just lighten up the image. There's also a contrast option. We have to select a very high option here because it is already a very contrasty image. It doesn't make a huge amount of difference. The most interesting one perhaps is gradient, and what this will do is take, at least if I select the flood fill option, take a flood filled region and apply a gradient in the chosen colour to make it look a little bit 3D. And I think the effect looks really quite striking. So then there's the tile option, which we've seen before, and a tint option. Now the tint option, again, I think mainly applies to flat filled regions, and so if I apply it over here where we have these leaves, it should push the colours a little bit more towards the blue. So let's see what happens, and indeed that seems to be what's going on. So yeah, there's a lot of different effects that you can apply to images with this version. If you're wondering where the image went, I actually had a thermal shutdown on my power supply. It must have overheated or something. But anyway, let's take a look at the drawing primitives that PC Paintbrush 4 Plus actually offers now. And they really aren't that much different to before. There are a couple of changes though. So first of all, the selective eraser apparently now changes colours from the foreground to background colour. I wasn't able to get it to do that in the earlier version, so let's see if it works in this version. Just make the size of this a little larger, and now it should actually change pixel colours from green to red, and indeed it is doing that, so the manual is correct there. The other big change is in the splines. Remember, we only had quadratic splines before, and so it seems now they've changed it so that you get cubic splines. So what that means, of course, is that you can change the tangent slope at each end. So there we go, and once you're happy with it, just click and you're done. So this is very nice to have cubic splines. They're much more flexible than the quadratic ones that we had. And the only other thing they really seem to have done is to combine some of the other options into the same button. So the left hand side of the button does an unfilled box, whereas the right hand side does a filled one. And similarly for the ellipses and so on. This one here is actually polygon. I think that they could have used a slightly better graphic for that. But anyway, let's try out their ellipses and see how that looks. And I'm guessing that if I go to show screen here, we'll see, yes, it's actually clipping at the edge of the image again. So nothing's changed there. Now, I already showed one image from PC Paintbrush 4 Plus, but this is another one that's in there, which seems to be a drawing, and obviously very good. It's hard to believe it was done in this program. Many of the other images were either photographs or they required a much higher resolution than I had this set up for. So I'm not going to show any of those, but yeah, I think this gives a good idea of what you could do with the program, in theory at least, if you're a great artist. Well, we've seen drawing programs right up to 1990, but what was the earliest drawing program for the PC? It's hard to say for sure, but this has to be a contender. It's called 4-point graphics. Now, it was called that because it has 4 different modes, which I'll show you in a moment. And this was at 1983, and I think it's written in BASIC, the hint being that it can load and save BASIC B-load files. Its main competitor was a program called PC Crayon, also at 1983. Unfortunately, I don't have a copy of that, but apparently it was quite similar. It had a high resolution mode. This one just supports glorious 4-color 320 by 200 CGA. Of course, EGA and VGA hadn't been invented at that point. So there is a demo mode here, but it's really just business graphics. It runs too fast on the 386 anyway, so I'm just going to go into the normal mode where we can actually draw pictures. Now we start off in 1-point mode, and if I press the minus key it puts me into draw mode, and this is basically the freehand drawing tool. Yeah, it's entirely keyboard driven, no mouse, no menus. So very primitive indeed, but stay with me because there are some interesting things here for such an early program. The next thing you can do in 1-point mode is to draw a circle, and if I just press the C, it will just draw the standard circle. What you're supposed to do is first get the size that you want by pressing the Z key. You'll see that updating in the upper right of the screen, and now when I press the C key again I'll get a circle. The other thing you can do is to change the aspect of this, and you'll see that in the very upper right of the screen. And when I do that, you'll see that I get a vertical ellipse, so very nice indeed. And in addition to that, I can actually also do a flood fill. So I'll just press F2 to change the color to red here, and from memory I have to press the W key for a flood fill. And that seems to work. One of the problems here is that a lot of the primitives have gaps in them, and so the colour escapes, but we've been lucky this time. But that's not all. What comes after 1-point mode is 2-point mode. So we go Shift-Tab to get into that, and it gives us a second point which we can move about, and I'll just put it in some random location on the screen here. And now when I press the L key, it will draw a straight line between the 2 points. And this is interesting way of drawing for sure. I imagine it would take a long time. The only other thing you can really do in 2-point mode is to blank to the right or to the left of the screen, and from memory it actually blanks from the object I just drew. So let's try that. And yeah, I'm not sure what you would use that for, but I guess we move on to 3-point mode. So Shift-Tab, and then a third point appears. Now in 3-point mode we get a third point that we can move about, and I'll just move this down to a nice location here so that I can really show what this does. And I press L, it will draw a parabola, aka a quadratic spline. So it really is in there, which is really interesting. And the other thing that we can do in 3-point mode is to draw an ellipse, but check this out. So an ellipse is Alt-L, and notice that that ellipse does not have its axes aligned with the screen. So this is a diagonal ellipse. Now from what I can tell, this is a real diagonal ellipse, not just a skew ellipse where each column was shifted by a different amount. It really is a rotated ellipse. But as you can see, there are some points missing, so unfortunately the flood fill feature doesn't work on this particularly well, and it's also not uniform in its thickness as it goes around, which is another problem with this particular algorithm. So of course then we're on to 4-point mode, and the weird thing with this is you have to go back to 1-point mode, then press Tab to get into 4-point mode. Very bizarre indeed. So then I can press Q to quickly place 4 points around the image. I don't know which image it thinks it's put the points around at the moment, but that's what it does. And then there are all sorts of effects that I can do. So for example, I can invert the image It's pretty slow. I think this really is written in BASIC, and I can turn it upside down. I can also rotate 90 degrees. I think that's the O key. So there's a whole load of different things that I can do here. Most of them aren't very exciting. I believe there's the possibility of drawing a box around the selected image and so on. So that's 4-point graphics. Pretty sophisticated really, given the technology that was available at the time. But probably not so useful nowadays, I would say. I couldn't see myself actually using this to draw computer graphics. Guys, I hope you've been enjoying this look at graphics programs of the 1980s, but I'm going to split the video here because we're probably only about halfway through and the video is already pretty long. And believe it or not, the best is yet to come. I also have some code of my own that I want to show. I've been implementing some of these primitives myself on the 386 in assembly language as fast as I can make them go. And I'm not going to be doing a drawing program, but I'm going to be animating them. And I'm pretty sure you can imagine the sort of things that you can do with some of those interesting curves at least. So look out for that in a later video. And let me know in the comments below, what were your favourite drawing programs of the 1980s? I'm just looking at consumer drawing programs for DOS at the moment, but there were a lot of really good ones out there. Anyway, that's it for this week. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye!